Good evening, everyone. I'm going to get started because we've got lots to talk about tonight. Thank you all for coming to our Integrity Forum on Reform's Great Healthy Democracy. I'm Eloise Carr, the Director of the Australian Institute here in Tassie. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the original owners of this island, Victorian, Tasmania, and Dickaluna, Hobart, country of the Rawanian people. As we meet here, we honour those people who are no longer here as a result of brutal invasion, and the Tasmanian Aboriginal community today who have never ceded sovereignty over their lands. I'd also like to acknowledge, given we're here to talk about democracy, that ours has a long way to go before it adequately reflects our country's history, and the Australian Institute stands ready to support work towards treaty and truth-telling. Thanks to everyone for coming, and especially to our panel members. I'm just looking around to see if I should be acknowledging elected representatives in the panel, but I can't see any, so I'll carry on.
Redwood more the company.
We are so fortunate tonight to have the Honourable Robert Redlich AM KC joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce Robert, who was Commissioner of the Victorian Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, also known as IBAC, from 2018 to 2023. Robert was previously a member of the Victorian Bar for some 30 years and served a period as Chair of the Victorian Bar Council. During this period, he commissioned the first inquiry into the legal profession into gender bias. His significant achievements in legal practice were recognised with his appointment as a Queen's Counsel in 1984, now King's Counsel, or KC. And I apologise if I haven't quite got the chronology of all this right, but some of Robert's work as a former Commonwealth Special Prosecutor included leading to the establishment of the National Crime Authority, and he was judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria for 15 years. He's also known for his work supporting young lawyers entering the profession. Thanks so much for being here, Robert. I'm sure most of you, if not everyone in the room, will know Meg Webb in terms of their birth and lesson. Meg also has a track record as an integrity champion for Tasmania, including advocating for stronger political donations laws, gambling reform, as well as a career in social justice advocacy prior to her political life. Meg successfully promoted greater transparency of ministerial diaries, although there's still work to be done there, assisted with the Integrity Commission's development of a new lobbyist framework, and most recently succeeded in establishing the Joint House Electoral Matters Committee. Congratulations, Meg. There's much more we could talk about Meg, but we'll save a little bit for later. And you can tell us more as the evening progresses. Many of you will also know Bill Brown, our Director of Democracy and Accountability at the Australian Institute. Bill has a background in environmental, social and governance analysis, and now leads research across a broad range of issues, including how we might be able to reduce the influence of money in politics, truth and political advertising laws, digital technology, and the role of states and the Senate in Australian democracy, among others. Thanks for visiting Tassie again, Bill. Tonight I'm going to ask most of the questions, but I will open the mic towards the end of our session, so do have a think about some questions if you have some burning questions. We're following up from integrity discussions that we held during the recent Tasmanian election, and a lot of our work, including our recently published report, The Democracy Agenda for a 51st Parliament, came out of those discussions. There's a two-page summary at the door if anyone's interested in that. Our recent state election resulted in the biggest crossbench ever elected, and a power sharing parliament, which is an exciting opportunity to pass legislation that doesn't necessarily have to have support of the government, as we saw recently with a couple of bills that passed, I think the week before last. So this is an unprecedented opportunity for parliamentarians that are reform-minded. I'd like to begin the conversation now, and I'll come to you first, Robert. Anti-corruption bodies or integrity commissions provide a key accountability mechanism in public administration by investigating and seeking to prevent corruption and misconduct. Can you please describe for our audience today the role of such bodies, including in investigating misconduct versus straight-out corruption, or what I think you often refer to as grey corruption? And how does the Integrity Commission's definition compare to other jurisdictions?
Thanks, Chloe. It's lovely to be here. I checked colleague given it's warmer here than it is in Melbourne. Look, I'd like to just set some home truths to start with in relation to the setting in which we talk about misconduct or corruption within the executive government environment. Whether we are talking about the commission of a crime or we're talking about misconduct of a lesser nature, if either the crime or the lesser form of misconduct results in decisions being made which don't suit the public interest, they are equally harmful to the welfare of the community. That is, they both damage the public trust to the same extent. And that's really important that we understand that as a fundamental in the setting we're going to explore this evening. Politics and integrity are always going to be in tension. The very nature of the political parties and their primary objective, which is either to get into power or to remain in power, is so frequently going to be antithetical to making ethically sound decisions. We have to just recognise that that's a fundamental of the political process. And the expectation that anybody that is a member of a political party, just a member of parliament, has an obligation of loyalty or allegiance to the party. Now, in that setting, I'd briefly like to make some observations about the change that's taken place in executive government over the last 4 decades. I've spoken about this publicly, and for those of you that have a particular historical interest, if you either go to the single pictures or the John Browning Memorial Lecture, the history of the executive government over 4 decades has been explored there. What I mean by executive government is the leader of the government, his or her ministers, their ministerial advisors, and the public service. They collectively comprise executive government. And over 4 decades, the form in which executive government has operated has changed. And I'm speaking now generally about Australia. We're seeing the emergence of the growing power of the leader of government, the centralisation of power around the leader. We have seen an extraordinary growth in the role of ministerial advisors. Ministerial advisors have one purpose, a political purpose, to ensure that their minister makes decisions which meet the political objectives of the party and that the minister doesn't get into strife over political issues. Third, we have the ministers themselves, and what we have seen over 4 decades is a gradual decline in the responsibility and independence of ministers. The Westminster Convention, which is a form of constitutional oversight, is so nuanced now that one could seriously argue that it's a convention which no longer has any real application. It means that, and I'm now speaking across Australia, I'm not just speaking about Victoria or Tasmania, we've seen countless examples of ministers who simply won't take responsibility for the decisions of their department or for the decisions of their ministerial advisors, who say that it's beyond them to control what their advisors or the departments do. And finally, we have the public service. But over 4 decades, we can see how the requirement of being frank and fearless advice to ministers and government has eroded. We only need to look at the recent Robo-Network Commission to see in the most glaring way how senior public servants have failed to honour that fundamental requirement. So that's the setting in which I would like to explore with everyone the reforms that we're going to talk about tonight, because they are reforms that are important because of the very current nature of the situation in which executive government operates, recognising that if we don't have adequate standards and we don't have adequate checks and balances which can be enforced, then politics too often will get in the way of decision-making which serves the public interest.
And that's what you mean when you're talking about grey corruption, isn't it, Robert?
It is. I use the term grey corruption to cover all the decision-making by executive government or arms of executive government, decision-making which does not serve the public interest, which is known by decision-makers not to serve the public interest, but is being made to serve some other improper purpose. Of course, it's a crime if we're talking about a minister who receives money in a brown paper bag. We're not talking here when we talk about great corruption, about the OBs and Minister McDonald. We're talking about persons within the cloak of executive government who make decisions which they know to be for an ulterior purpose, which does not serve the public interest, too often a political purpose.
So that means decisions in the interest of the party or a particular politician rather than in the public interest.
Okay. Sorry.
So on that, if I may ask a follow-up question, the current government here committed to a thing which I think they're going to call a stability clause, whereby if a member decides to leave a political party, they can be forced out of their seat in Parliament. Now, that doesn't seem very democratic to me, and I was interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Well, when you mentioned that proposed legislation, we might just delete it. I had to do some research of my own to verify that any government, whatever their political disclosure, could contemplate something that is so antithetical to the fundamentals of the democratic institution of Parliament. And so I went to the Code of Conduct for Members of Parliament because I wanted to see how you could possibly reconcile a proposal that a member of Parliament who conscientiously decides that they cannot vote with the government of the day, albeit when it's their party's government, but cannot conscientiously vote for a particular issue, that person will be obliged to vacate their position in Parliament. It is the most remarkable piece of legislation, if it ever is brought forward, that is imaginable, and it demonstrates the very point I was making, namely how politics can intrude to override the public interest. So I looked at the values which are enshrined in the members of Parliament's Code of Conduct. And the first value is The public interest is the fundamental objective of members of Parliament. Quote, it is their task to, quote, act solely in terms of the public interest. Now, with that obligation in place, how can anyone be asked to vacate their obligation in order to comply with a statutory objective that they vote with the government of the day, regardless of their view about whether it serves the public interest? And the final value, which I also noted, is a value that they pursue ethically political practices that support democratic traditions and reject political corruption. So I made mention of this because he seems to me it's the most glaring example, explicit example of how politics can intrude into the decision-making which should be solely for the purpose of pursuing the public interest. It is truly amazing that in this day and age anyone could contemplate a piece of legislation like that. If he ever came forward, like we're saying now, he would be destined to go to the High Court.
Thank you. Please, go ahead.
I'll just jump into the gentleman's comment on that when we get to any questions. We don't get to this point all of a sudden. We don't arrive here abruptly. We've arrived at the point of having this proposal put to us in the election campaign, and now being progressed by the government of the day, apparently, through an extended period of time of a government that disrespects the Parliament and what it stands for in terms of representing the state of Tasmania, the people of Tasmania. We've just seen example after example, this government over a period of 10 years eroding respect for the Parliament and how it's supposed to work. And that happens in small ways and it happens in cumulative ways over time. We get to this point where something so overt and so excessively against what is supposed to be the proprietors of our Parliament that is proposed and is thought to be and presented to the Tasmanian people as an appropriate and reasonable step. And I'm thinking about small things. I'll give you an example of the small erosions over time that I've observed when I'm there. We get legislation coming through where you would expect when there is a responsibility of a minister to do something, that minister would have to table it in Parliament in order for Parliament to have oversight of the decision made by the minister. That would happen as a matter of course in so many ways, in so many bits of legislation. And at times this government has absolutely regularly pushed back on it and tried to not include that in legislation, or when we've tried to insert it in, rejected amendments to do that. So that's just a tiny little sort of, it looks technical, and on every single piece of legislation that comes through where that is a feature, where they decided not to be accountable with Parliament, and in Parliament we're trying to assert Parliament's responsibility for that, and they're pushed up on it. Every little time seems like a little time, but 10 years of overload, what you get through that and a multitude of other things being arise here. So I think it's similar to the changes you described to our more that is the environment and executive governance and accountability. This is it, big challenge, I think.
Now, while you've got the talking stick, man, I'm going to get to the RTI business. I know everyone's busting to hear from me on that. But just before we do, late last year, the Tasmanian Parliament passed its first ever donations disclosure laws for political donations. It's been resoundingly criticised as inadequate. I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of what it does and doesn't achieve, including the role of third parties and whether or not they are adequately regulated. This is back on the agenda now, in case anyone missed this, thanks to the Greens tabling a bill in Parliament to try and address some of the gaps in the current legislation. I just thought we'd get an overview from Nick, please, including what happens next with that process.
Sure. we'll try and do a really quick prompt history. I reckon there's a lot of people in the room that are familiar with this stuff. Forgive me if I'm preaching to you there, telling you things that I'm like, you know that I'm going to repeat now. In 2018, after our horrendous state election of 2018 that was bought by the gambling industry, just after that, February at the time, we were promised to introduce political donation laws to this state because we didn't have any. We didn't have any at all. We were only having to comply with federal political donation laws. So that was in May 2018, that promise was made. And we waited and we waited and we waited and we waited. And some efforts were made to develop these laws. Some consultations were done on draft laws. Everything that was said to them in those consultations they ignored. And eventually we had a bill come to Parliament, eventually in end of 2021. However, under the table at the end of 2021, it got debated, didn't get debated in the House, I think, until early 2023, that early last year, and then sat in the upper house for months and months and months and didn't get brought on to debate until the latter part, 2023. So we had a long wait to get our first bit of donation laws, and all the wonderful expert advice provided to them during consultation on those bills was ignored. So what came to us in Parliament was a pretty poor set of laws. Things you would expect to see in political donation laws are a disclosure limit. So if you donate over a certain amount, it has to be disclosed publicly. That disclosure limit, everybody says, should be $1,000. In the bill, it's $5,000, for example. Timeliness is another thing. We should know who's donating in a timely fashion, particularly going into an election, so that voters can be informed voters when they go to an election and know who's made donations to the people that the parties and candidates they are choosing from. So timeliness is important. In the bill that came to us, timeliness had some deficiencies. During election times, it was a 7-day period, which meant that because most donations in elections happened in the last week of the election campaign, you wouldn't actually know when you went to the election who donated. And outside election times, it was every 6 months. Not good enough. Not good enough. The other thing you would expect to see that sort of legislation in putting in place, a set of laws, would be efforts around how to control third-party and associated entity donations and expenditure during political, particularly during election campaigns. It's a pretty technical part. It's really difficult in a way. Third-party entities is when somebody's going to spend money to help influence the outcome of an election. So by saying, vote for these people, they're wonderful, or don't vote for those people, they're not wonderful, or maybe by saying, this is an issue that's really important, have this issue in mind when you go to vote, and here's what the different people say about it. So third-party campaigning can look a bit different and varied, but it's people who spend money to try to influence the way you're going to vote as a voter, and they're not a party and they're not a candidate themselves. We want laws around how money is donated and spent by third-party campaigners in an election, for sure. It's pretty fairly, though, trying to work it out to make it fair. Because in some senses, you get quite big cashed-up corporations and sectors and industries doing that sort of activity, and that's what we saw, for example, here in our 2018 election. We saw the focus industry fund a massive London local campaign. Most of you might remember, great big signs on pubs around the state saying, don't vote Greens, don't vote Labor, all that. But also you can get NGOs in the community services sector being third-party campaigns on issues that they think are really important at election time. That was what I was doing in the 2019 election, actually, because at the time I worked for Andy there, and we thought focus were a really important issue in that election. And although we didn't campaign saying, vote for them and Labor vote for them, we did campaign on the issue and spent money on it and those sorts of things like that. So we were third-party campaigners there too, that all I had then. So it's hard to make laws about third-party campaigners. It's a curly issue to discuss here, but the bill that we had deals with it in a particular sort of way. I think there's going to be problems with it. You'll be interested to see if the items bill addresses that. I'm not sure whether it tells that it could be at the present time. On the Greens bill, and I will spend too long on this topic, but on the Greens bill, they are trying to address some of the issues in the government's bill which passed last year. Just to be clear too, the bill passed last year because Labor backflipped on it. Labor were going to introduce a whole bunch of amendments to it and would have had the support in the upper house. We would have got them through and fixed. Just about everything I mentioned, actually, we would have fixed in the upper house. But Labor backflipped and waved it through. It passed the chamber, it got royal assent. It's not actually operational yet. It's not proclaimed because the Electoral Commission needs to set up the bureaucracy government needs to set up the systems in place to operate it. There's lots of reporting systems and things that are needed. There's lots of education that's needed. So the laws are passed. They're sitting there. They're waiting to be switched on, proclaimed. And we went to an election. So we had another election without those laws actually in operation. So the Greens now brought a bill to amend those laws, even though they're not yet switched on, which is interesting. That bill has come to the lower house and they began debate on it then. And during debate, the bill has now been sent to a committee to have a closer look at it. And it's been sent to a new committee that's been formed in the lower house. It's called Government Administration B Committee. That happens to have the portfolio of justice under it, and so therefore the bill's got to the tower. So submissions are open now through the 12th of July on that bill. If you want to jump on the Parliament website, you'll find details about this. You'll find the Greens bill. You'll find ways to make submissions. You can support things in that bill. You can suggest things that aren't in that bill. You can discuss in whatever way you like, make it sufficient to help the Parliament on its view. The committee then will look at it, bring it back to Parliament with some recommendations, and it will then be debated again on passes to the letters comes to the House. Can I also say that the original bill from the government, which was passed last year, and the Greens bill, both utterly failed to take into consideration the upper house and the party, in my view. And as you can imagine why I'm particularly interested in that, it's every young house. One of the things that we've done with our donations laws is we have put in place public funding for the lower house elections, not for upper house elections. That wasn't considered. It said, like it was just in number. Even though in the upper house are perfectly situated to have public funding in our elections, because we've already have rules for upper house where we've got a spending cap, and we've also we've got a spending cap where we can't get third-party campaigners in our elections for the upper house. So it's a great space to put public funding, but they didn't do that. They also gave themselves in the lower house extra administrative funding to comply with the recording rules in the bill, in the Act. But not then. We have to comply with those reporting rules too, and they gave us no public funding, no administrative funding for that at all in that part. So there's some gaps there, that one thing that I hope to talk to the Greens about in terms of their bill. But
I wanted to do it. Thank you. That's very helpful and great opportunity for everyone to get involved. Bill, I'd like to ask you the next question, please. I just really appreciate a quick overview of the report you and I prepared in time for this Parliament called the Democracy Agenda to 51st Tasmanian Parliament. How was it developed and what are some of the priority recommendations, please?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a Dominic Dixon outline, but
Yes, thank you. Well, we have a saying at the Australia Institute that democracy thrives on high expectations. And it's really in that spirit that we put together the democracy agenda for Tasmania. Things that people could genuinely be excited about, reforms that could feasibly be pursued by our members of parliament, that could be demanded by the public and by community groups, but things that would genuinely shake up how things work in Tasmania. Then we open that with have quite a history of democratic reform in the state so far. Coming from Canberra, the way our territory elections are conducted owes a lot to what was developed in Tasmania. We've got Robson rotation, named after a Tasmanian Liberal MP. We've got Hannah Clark, being an Attorney General of Tasmania way back in the day, developing proportional representation. So we know that Tasmania can do bold, interesting democratic innovations that take shape elsewhere. And then compiling this agenda, Eloise and I look back over how things are working in other states and territories, recommendations that have come out of parliamentary inquiries or from parliamentarians in Tasmania to get a sense of what might be possible. So as well as donation reform, integrity commission reform, we looked at ministerial diaries. Right down the East Coast, they're increasing, Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, demanding more and more from ministers, and in some cases shadowing ministers, to open up their diaries, reveal what they've done, who they've been meeting with, potentially what they've been discussing that I think have been equally rigorous with Tasmanian diary disclosures too. In New Zealand, documents that go to Cabinet are released about 30 days after they're seen by Cabinet, which gives the public then an insight into the deliberations of Cabinet and the grounds on which they're making their decisions. South Australia has had truth and political advertising laws for about 40 years now, and they could work in Tasmania on just the same lines that they've been working in South Australia. We recommended an electoral matters committee, so that's good evidence that these are achievable objectives if we fight for them.
Tick that one onto the list.
Done.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you now, Robert. An important aspect of investigating and preventing misconduct by public officers is being sane to do so. Yet, Tasmania's Integrity Commission has never held a public hearing. It often chooses not to release the results of its investigations, and some Tasmanians describe the Integrity Commission as having a culture of secrecy. The Commission's board uses a public interest test to determine whether it will hold an inquiry and public hearings, and apparently public hearings are very expensive, and so is publishing reports and producing things to that standard. Do you think that the lack of transparency is a result of somehow the public interest test being set too high, or is it a budgetary concern that not insufficient resources are being dedicated, or is it something else?
The first question, Integrity Commission has got a critical role to play in all states and territories in Australia. Why? Because they are able to investigate, and if their scope jurisdictions adequate, expose misconduct, whether it be principal or whether it be soft grade corruption, as I mentioned earlier. Having been invited here, I've looked at the Tasmanian Integrity Commission, and what struck me initially was, if you look at the original legislation, what was contemplated was not that the Board of Inquiry, which would actually conduct a hearing. Board of Inquiries is the second or third step in the process. First, it has to be investigated by an investigator. Ultimately, it might come to the board, and the board would then make a decision about whether it conducts an investigation and ultimately whether it holds an inquiry. The inquiry contemplated under the original legislation bore none of the characteristics of a Royal Commission inquiry. The essence of a Royal Commission inquiry, or the inquiries that can be conducted by any other integrity commission around Australia, is that you can decide what issue has to be pursued. You call people before the inquiry. They have an exemption that is afforded to in every Royal Commission and every Integrity Commission, that anything that they say in the course of their evidence is not admissible against them in a court of law. Now that is the key requirement of a Royal Commission or Integrity Commissions elsewhere. And that's what enables the Commission or the Royal Commission to get to the bottom of allegations of misconduct. That the person in the witness box cannot say, I refuse to answer that because it will incriminate me. Hence, for a long time, that was the handicap that the Board of Inquiry was under, that were they to hold an inquiry, every person who was under suspicion would complain, would take privilege, that they would be self-incriminating themselves, and they would not be able to explore them out. Then they amended the Act more recently so that the privilege can now be claimed by going to the Supreme Court if they claim privilege against self-incrimination. But it still prevents the Commission from being able to pursue the matter. So I can understand if you're a commissioner at the Tasmanian Integrity Commission, you will look very carefully at what the prospect is of having any sort of meaningful inquiry if you're going to be faced with persons of interest who will simply be able to avoid having to answer questions. That's the current difficulty with the legislation, because every Royal Commission, every Integrity Commission around Australia has a provision which says that you can't make that claim to privilege because everything you say will not be used against you in a court of law. That's how Royal Commissions and Integrity Commissions everywhere else get to the bottom of things. Take, for example, IBAC and the Berejiklian inquiry. The former Premier could not avoid answering the question asked of her because the privilege had been removed. That is, the privilege against self-incrimination had been removed. Mr Andrews couldn't avoid answering my questions and inquiries because the privilege is removed. You need to have that privilege removed in order for inquiries to proceed. Now we come to the question of public inquiries. I mean, it is amazing that in 2009, I think the Commission started, it's amazing that you haven't had a public inquiry. Why is it important to have a public inquiry? Why is it important that any significant investigation is published so that the community can read about it? Because ultimately that is the only way in which executive government will respond to misconduct which is exposed. If there's no publicity about it, the risk is far too high that politicians will simply find ways to avoid having to address it. I only need to point to Victoria and recent events. We published a report in Operation Daintree concerning a union that obtained a contract which it should never have been given because it didn't have the expertise to deliver on the contract. Because that inquiry was not public, the Premier was able to say quite incorrectly to the public that there were no findings of corruption made in that report. If, of course, he meant by corruption findings of a crime, he was correct. If he meant there were no findings, which he repeated over and over to the media, he was misleading the public. But that couldn't have happened had there been a public inquiry. Had there been a public inquiry which went over some weeks, it would have been impossible for a politician to mislead the public about the content of the report. Public publicity is critical to the exposure of misconduct. And let me say immediately that anyone who talks about having a public inquiry will always justifiably be concerned that people's reputations are not unreasonably damaged. There's a quid pro quo here, and that is that a corruption commission, an integrity commission, when deciding whether or not to conduct a public inquiry, must, under the legislation in every other state, decide whether or not the evidence is sufficient to ensure that the person who's being examined in public will not be exposed to unreasonable damage to their reputation. How do you ensure that doesn't occur? You look at the evidence that's available to you before you start an inquiry, and you determine whether or not that evidence sufficiently shows that the person has engaged in misconduct. Once you're satisfied with that, then you are no longer concerned that the person's reputation will be unreasonably damaged. It's pretty simple. And that is, again, a provision that you don't have in your legislation. if that was there, and it's in all of the other Integrity Commission's legislation, some provision is there to ensure that a commission won't call people in public if their reputation can be unfairly harmed. Then the largest argument that's ever raised in relation to having public inquiries disappears. Of course you don't have a public inquiry if there's no public interest to be served in doing so. But it's important that the legislation here in relation to the Tasmanian Integrity Commission needs to be substantially amended to enable public hearings to take place and at the same time protect reputations. To finally answer your question, does the budget matter? Of course it does. Tasmania has a budget of just in excess of $3 million. I'm thinking of Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland with budgets of $50, $60, $70 million. Yes, they're larger states, larger populations. You can't do anything with $3 million. Who is seriously suggesting that the Tasmanian Integrity Commission can make a serious contribution to exposing misconduct with a budget like that? The first million of that will go on the salaries of the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioners. And then you've got $2 million left to pay for whatever investigations in private are done. I don't know how anybody can seriously say to the public of Tasmania that with a budget like that, the Integrity Commission could play any significant role in exposing misconduct. And perhaps therein lies the answer for why it hasn't held public hearings. When public hearings are perhaps a little more expensive than a private hearing, but you have to go through the same process. You have to call witnesses. Each witness is entitled to have legal representation. The inquiry takes the same length of time, whether it's done in public or private. Either way, it's a costly exercise. $3 million does not give an Integrity Commission any real capacity to make a contribution. Now, I suspect if the Integrity Commission, I know Greg well, he came to all of the Integrity Commission meetings. We would meet twice a year over my period as Commissioner. I know Greg well, and I know that had he the capacity to make a serious public contribution through exposing misconduct, he would do so. That the legislation as it presently exists inhibits any capacity for the Commission to do so. And there, I think, is the fundamental problem.
And the budget issues almost sound like it's a deliberate attempt to handicap the Commission's work by not giving them enough resources.
I'm reluctant to attribute a motivation. And look at that thing. There's no one political party that's worse than the other. Please make no mistake here. This is not about a criticism of one party or they're both equally capable of instituting regimes which serve their interest rather than the political interest, the public interest. It's really important that we recognise that. It's the fundamental of politics. Getting into power, staying in power, not making decisions which will harm us, preventing the decisions which cause damage at the voting booth. That's what drives the politician. And if there are no codes of conducts that can be enforced, no Integrity Commission that has sufficient power and influence, then politicians will rule the day in terms of their decision making. And therein is the challenge for Tasmania.
And I think it's really interesting, actually, because we would pick up that same theme about a lack of funding to adequately do the things that need to be done through our integrity entities. as they all are, as I said, when you think of things like our ombudsman. First thing that will come into our minds is our underfunded ombudsman with 7 hats to wear that can't do all the things that need to be done through that office. And it's a small jurisdiction problem to some extent, and it's valid to actually ask ourselves, to what extent can we afford to adequately fund our integrity entities, such as they are, a suite of them, to do the jobs we need them to do? Because even though we're a small jurisdiction with a small population and a small overall budget, we are still a state. We still have a state parliament that functions as a state parliament, has to do all the things that the parliaments in other jurisdictions that are 10 times our size need to do. And our integrity entities are the same. They're still got to do the same function, but we're small and we have challenges with the budget side. So it's a really interesting trade-off. I'd be really interested to hear from you, Robert, about your reflections on that. How can we as a small jurisdiction meet those challenges given the constraints which we all have to acknowledge are there genuinely, regardless of the political persuasion, as you say, or the political motivations of whoever's in charge on the day. Can you point to how to balance those trade-offs between both the challenges and actually effectively undertaking any integrity function?
Well, the codes of conduct which govern the behaviour of ministers, ministerial advisors, public servants, need to be clear, capable of being enforced. And if they are clear and capable of being enforced, then you are a long step forward in terms of fighting breaches of integrity. The Tasmanian Integrity Commission's definition of misconduct gives it ample opportunity to look at misconduct that's not criminal, but which doesn't serve a public interest, and which is a breach of those codes of conduct. And it doesn't necessarily have to hold a public hearing in order to investigate and then publish a report which exposes that conduct. The Integrity Commission has a really important prevention and education function. Now, I'm not suggesting that the government of the day here should suddenly find $50 or $60 million. As you say, one's got to have regard to the size of the community that's being serviced. But a budget of $10, $15 million will surely be necessary if the Commission is going to be able to discharge its function adequately. I know we're going to talk about some other issues on your agenda, Louise. Let me just say that I think it's critical that we have an integrity commission in every state that's able to discharge its function effectively, that the people of every state, regardless of the political colour of the government of the day, is entitled to nothing less.
Thank you. Meg, please. Today, on the front page of the Web version, in case anyone missed it, a right to information expert described our system as being like an episode of the ABC's political satire Utopia.
Yeah, that's sure.
We've had inquiry and we've had recommendations and reports telling us how we can fix this system, yet nothing seems to have changed. What on earth is going on? Can you please tell us?
What on earth is that? How many people in the room have tried to do an RTI request? Oh, goodness, yes. Now, how many of you got it's all done and dusted in the legislative time? Anyone? Only 1, 2. Wow. And how many people got the entirety of what they asked for in terms of the full disclosure of information? Well, probably just on one line of our yeah. So those are some of the key things. We've actually had a really good piece of legislation in our legislation. In essence, it was a really good one. When we changed the reading of freedom of information and FOI system into this current ITI system, we went into a push model rather than a pull model. So theoretically, it's supposed to be based on the concept that the government pushes information out as proactively as possible, and you don't have to go in and drag it out of them. That's the basis of our legislation. It's the right basis of our legislation. It's not what we see happening. And that's why we see, when we look at the stats and the data on Tassie compared to other jurisdictions, we see we do not comply with our statutory timelines to anything like the level that other states do. And we do not fully disclose information to anything like the level that other states do. People here are much more likely to receive absolute refusal or to receive a partial disclosure. We have much higher rates then, because of that, of decisions that may be sent for review. And our system requires that you have an internal review first with the department that you're seeking information from. And then if you get no joy with that, you can go to an external review, which is the Ombudsman's office. And we all know, probably from the reporting that's done in the paper about it, that process can then take years. I just got one back just in the last week or so that's 3 years old. So this is a system that's broken in many cases, but mostly it's because it's a culture that sits around it, not necessarily the rules that are in the legislation and the model that it's based on, the push model. That's all fine. That's what was happening, and that's what the culture was. If you have a culture within public service and other departments, and that culture is set at the top, and it's set by the political masses at the top as well as departmental masses at the top. If that culture is telling you to withhold information and to release as little as possible and to hold on to things as tightly as possible and to make decisions in the narrowest possible way, then you get what we've got now with all these impediments and all these delays and all these problems. It's simply not good enough. It's just ridiculous. It is a funding issue that comes into it to some extent. One of the reasons the Ombudsman's office is has such a big backlog of external review requests is that there's been starting to do it. Every now and then the government tips some more money into that to try to process them more quickly. That's fine, but actually what we really need is a concerted focus on changing culture. And that's something that needs to come to the top, and it needs to come through public pressure as well. So it's good that it gets onto the front page of the directory. I think that's excellent, because we do need to bring some shade to our system that is failing us right now, you know. I remember I was visiting New Zealand to look into some integrity matters and learn from their back in Hobart, a little learning trip. And talking to their public service commissioner about their RTI and how successful they are in releasing information. And it was astounding. They were quite embarrassed that they were only sitting at something like 98% of disclosures back. And they were really trying to improve that. I just sat there being dumbstruck, really, shaking my head. And when he said that New Zealand doesn't have an integrity body, which is interesting, and I asked them about that and said, why do you not have the integrity commissioner integrity body of some sort? And they said, we don't need one here because we don't have corruption. We don't know where we're uncomfortable about. I suspect they were thinking about brown paper bag corruption, not the grey corruption, or the sort of corruption that I call relational influence. And it's a small jurisdiction problem too. We all know each other pretty well, and everybody's connected in all sorts of ways, and relationships come thought to be that's another form of sort of corruption in that grey space to some extent. I don't brace away from RTIs, but we might want to talk more about RTIs. We do need to it's a cultural issue. I think it's also needing more investment. And we should probably have a better legislation, because it's been a while since we did, which is not to say that it's fundamentally for improvement. It's a good model. But the fact that we've been allowed as a state to get away with implementing it so poorly for such a long time tells us it's probably something we should look at and improve about. So absolutely, basically, review and reform might be a order of the day as well. Thanks.
If I can jump in there, I think it's particularly troubling Tasmania to do so poorly on those metrics, because the rest of Australia is not doing great on RTI or freedom of information law either. And one thing the Australian Institute's been looking at is the delays that occur in the FOI system, both when you're making your FOI request, but then also if you request a review from the information commissioner. There's a dedicated commissioner at the federal level, and there's something equivalent in states and territories as well. You might be waiting 4 years for a decision coming back from that independent arbiter. And of course, as soon as the public servant making the original decision knows that the process of review is going to take so long, they know that they can make their decisions with impunity. And it's very difficult as an FOI or RT or an applicant to be able to argue against an FOI officer's decision that, for example, they can't give you a bit of information because of its national security implications, because you don't get to see what that information is, and no way of arguing against that claiming. And so I think absolutely from a kind of cultural point of view in the first place, the public servants feel beholden to their minister or the senior public servants rather than to the public, goes into why those FOI requests don't get processed always in good faith, but then also the lack of resourcing and lack of willpower sometimes from those regulators also plays into why there isn't that fear in the hearts of FOI officers.
I think you put your finger on it when you identify the fact that the requirements for freedom of information exposure are clear, and yet how does it come about that when the Ombudsman looks at the refusal in 83% of cases, I think something like that, the Ombudsman has found that the department has made the wrong decision in refusing to provide the information, which leads to the question, how do we address the fact that too much of the public service, too much of the time, feels beholden to simply deliver on the government of the day's objectives? We've fallen away quite badly. In Victoria, in Operation Daintree, I had one of the executive directors of the health department candidly tell me that there was quite an indefensible culture of growth within the department not to give the minister advice that was contrary to what they knew the government of the day wanted. That is to disregard the right view of the decision and simply provide the minister and the ministerial advisor what they were looking for. But that's the order of the day. That's what the Commissioner found in RoboDev. ICAC reports are full of similar findings. Each year, the commissioners get together and say the same thing. The only way that can be rectified is by having such clear codes of conduct and the knowledge that they will be enforced.
Yeah, I think that's really key, and I see as a white here from CPSU, and we've talked about this before running in similar forums. It actually has to be safe for people who are working in the public service to report things going wrong and make complaints safely. So that means whistleblower protection for a start. And our Public Interest Disclosure Act also is very sorely in need of a good hard look, because it doesn't necessarily provide the adequate safety and protections for that to happen. And even on a lesser level, public servants need to see consequences occur when people do the wrong thing. So a complaint might be made about some particular behaviour that's happened or a decision that's been made, and that is properly and transparently and accountably investigated, and there's a consequence to it. And so often I think that doesn't happen. And in fact, I think what a lot of public servants end up seeing is people who even habitually engage in, let's call it poor decision making, actually prosper and be promoted and have things go their way. And then you get clusters of those people who've all been promoted into senior levels together. And that's problematic. If you're a public servant and you see things that are being done that are wrong, or are decisions that have been made poorly, not in the public interest, and you can't see that there are proper consequences when things are complained about and brought to the attention of the proper authorities, you're going to then do one of two things. You'll either leave and get the hell out of there because you've had enough and it's really disheartening, or you'll just sort of collapse in place and keep doing your job, put your head down and just decide that that's just how the world works. And that's utterly unacceptable, because that is not how the world should work. and it is not going to work us through. But we need to have those mechanisms there, and our police need to see them deliver on matters of integrity.
It just occurred to me as you were speaking on Ben that one of the recommendations made by the Tasmanian Integrity Commission has been to implement reforms to deal with what I think are called grants here in Tasmania. We call them pre-election commitments. And I don't know.
I think is what you're,
Indeed.
where this is going.
Indeed. And so let me talk about Victoria for just a moment, because it's really illustrative of the problem of big grants. The Commonwealth Games, which Victoria announced in a pre-election period, saying that they would bring the Commonwealth Games to regional cities of Victoria. And you could imagine what that did to the vote at the election for regional Victoria. The government of the day, their return rose markedly because of that pre-election commitment. The decision had not been the subject of a proper business case analysis. The Auditor General, you probably are aware of it, but in Victoria there was a report released about a month ago by the Auditor General who reviewed the whole saga of the Commonwealth Games, noting how poor the assessment was of the costs or the benefits of doing what was announced. For example, the Auditor General found that when listing the benefits of holding the Commonwealth Games in the regions, it was said that there would be a saving of in excess of $300 million in health benefits, which would otherwise have to be borne by government, by the communities in the regions becoming healthier because they'd be more interested in sport as a result of the games coming to the regions. Laughable, so it's there. That report, unfortunately, did not get a lot of public exposure in Victoria. In a different time and in a different era, that's the sort of report that would have brought a government down. So scandalous was that process. Similarly, some of you are probably familiar with the rail loop, which Victorian government's now embarked upon. Again, a process by the pre-election commitment, a grant, where no proper business case was undertaken. Indeed, in that case, the Premier and a small number of cabinet ministers made the decision before it was even communicated at all to the public service or to any of the government agencies who have responsibility for public transport in Victoria. And we're stuck with it, because what does the Premier say after a grant or a pre-election commitment is made and then they win the election? They say, I have a mandate. Don't you dare challenge what I'm saying or doing. I have a mandate from the electorate, and any argument that is to be raised that really there wasn't a proper cost-benefit analysis undertaken, that it's not going to serve the public interest, will be rejected out of hand. Now, those are recommendations which the Commission's put forward. I don't know why they haven't been adopted.
I think we do have a lot of it. I think we do have mine, don't we? Because of the elections, like how convenient to ignore those recommendations and just go making pork barrel relay to the Alfredo.
Well, it is a form of pork barrelling, you're quite right. But it's a very serious development that pre-election commitments or grants is now the order of the day.
And in fact, when that happened in our 2021 election, and the complaints were made to our Integrity Commission, the Integrity Commission first of all said, oh, what a shame we can't look at that in terms of investigating, because it happened during the election period, and by the way, we don't have jurisdiction over ministers while they're in election with hearings, because they're not actually holding a seat at that time, even though they're still where the minister will have during the head of government, no jurisdiction over it. However, after the 2021 election, our Integrity Commission did do some research papers about how to avoid pork barrelling, because obviously we needed to know that in this state, certainly not in honesty. They took 2 research papers, and they're great. They've got really good information in them, and they're sitting on a shelf somewhere, and they're probably really dusty. What would have been great, having done that after the 2021 election, when an election was called in February this year, on the 16th of February, I think it was, when the government called an early election, a year early, I would have thought the first thing the Integrity Commission might have done, given its requirement to be an education body as well, and preventively, first thing it could have done would proactively be to write to all parties and say, oh, by the way, just to remind you, we did these 2 great research papers about how not to access at court bail when you guys this case. Here they are, and they could have done that publicly and made it a point of education, not just for the parties, but for the general public as the election to request. Did they do it? No, they didn't. The only thing they did do when the election was held was come out and remind all of us that were running for election not to talk about or speculate about people that might be getting investigated requirements because they might break the law if we did it. So they remind us about that, but forgot to remind us about the excellent work they did and the very good outline, guidelines they produced about how not to talk.
I do recommend that if people are interested, they read the Institute, the Australian Institute's Late to Withdraw document, which sets out a compelling argument for the reforms, something which we've discussed tonight, but which should all be read because it's a very valuable document.
Thanks, Rodney. Bill, last question for you. Just on political finance reform and levelling the playing field for newcomers to politics and first-time candidates and new entrants. What are the risks associated with some reforms that can actually have perhaps unintended side effects or consequences? And I know you've been researching this lately because it's on the agenda nationally as well as in Tasmania. So I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the risks and that's a big pain.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the last year or so, it's been quite a focus of the Democracy and Accountability Program, just how changes to political finance laws have worked or not worked in other states and territories. So we did a deep review of Victoria's laws. They have donation caps and generous public funding in place, and New South Wales public funding, donation caps and spending caps there as well. As I always mentioned, at the federal level, we're expecting from the Albanese government some kind of law reform proposal before the end of the year. And just last week, maybe the week before last, South Australia's Premier Peter Malinauskas announced a ban on political donations in South Australia. And with all of these issues, I think it really is a case that the devil is in the detail. None of those reforms are good or bad, except with how, in practice, they work and to affect the political competition. So in public funding, what we've seen is that the ways that public funding is being done in Australia, in practice, serve to benefit incumbents at the expense of new entrants who might come into the playing field. The main form is per vote public funding. So after the current election, if you get a certain share of the vote, you get maybe $3 per vote you receive.
$6 per vote in Tasmania's political laws passed last year. Absolutely rewarding. No donation caps, no expenditure caps alongside.
Very generous. I should also say that federally or in South Australia, for example. But if you're an independent, if you're a minor party that's just started up, you haven't run in another election, you don't get any public funding, but you're competing against someone who, at the federal level, we're talking tens of millions of dollars for major parties. Another option, funding parties based on how many parliamentarians they have. Again, the new entrant doesn't get that benefit. Similarly, with donation caps, we run into a problem there that the incumbents with the public funding don't need to raise as much as a challenger does. So they lose less from imposing strict donation caps. That's before you get onto some of the exceptions or opportunities for double dipping, which we've seen in other states that mean that in practice, a party can collect much more from a single donor than an independent challenger could. There's also a problem there if you do extend donation caps to third parties, A corporation that's funded by profits doesn't need donations in order to run a political campaign, but an environmental corp NGO, a community group, very well may depend on donations. If those are capped, that limits their ability, but it doesn't stop vested interests. And finally, on spending caps, because the advantages of incumbency are so substantial, particularly for a sitting member of Parliament, Mayor, the communications budget, the travel allowance, an office or multiple offices provided on the taxpayer, as well as their own staff. Somebody's coming in is starting from behind. If they and the incumbent have the same spending cap, then in practice, the incumbent actually has much more of a head start that the challenger can never catch up to. Not necessarily insurmountable problems for any of these changes, and indeed, in terms of public funding, we've looked at places like Seattle, where they're doing democracy vouchers. Every person on the electoral roll gets $100 worth of vouchers that they can distribute to the candidates that they support. That's a good way of testing people's candidates' genuine public support, but in a way that actually makes the money usable when it matters before the election. And similarly, I actually think Tasmania has some advantages for spending caps that would avoid some of the problems that we've seen in New South Wales. In the interest of time, I might just point you to our agenda for the details there.
Thanks, it sounds like there's a risk of concentrating power in the major parties.
Absolutely.
We are rapidly running out of time, and I did promise the opportunity to ask questions. Does anyone have a question? Yeah. Say.
Hi, Meg. This runs on the president of Tasmanian Dog Walking Clubs. Let me that owning a dog is not a political action, it actually is. Heavily involved in the anti-climate racing movement, and there's a bucket increase of the lobby still going through the Racing Regulation and Integrity Act bill, which is meant to improve the integrity within racing when you read it as the complete opposite. And one of the things we've noticed, we do a lot of arguing almost about changing dogs and that sort of thing, and in fact the commissioner who will replace the director of racing will be exempt from RTI. I refuse on it.
Goodness gracious.
It's coming to you.
These tweet to us.
Yeah.
I'll be taking a very deep dive into that,
Yeah.
no doubt.
Yeah.
Probably be coming to see English from anyone who's interested, actually, but particularly from most that are actively involved.
Yeah.
Look, I think we have to be thoughtful about who we exempt from RTI, and then there are some other those sorts of statutory roles, like our justice relation commissioner, for example, that's exempted from RTI, and others like that. We would want to have a really good look at the role that's proposed there for that commissioner to see the same rationale for accepting that role sits.
Yeah. Because racing,
or not.
here, racing in Tasmania is a key area for grey and relational corruption.
Indeed. I mean, it's any industry where there's a lot of money involved, a lot of people make a lot of money out of that industry. It's pretty ripe for influencing then legal decision making around the rules, regulations, fully passed. So we'll take a close look at it.
Thank you.
Look, another question? You must take it. Come out. Good news is one that's happening in the Upper House now, just so you all know, some of you might be aware already, but since the recent legislative elections in May, we have now broken the predominance of the two major parties, so they have had the majority between the two of them up there for the last 4 years, and now we're back to independents and minor parties having the majority in our House, so we've got the opportunity to actually get amendments through and activity through there that the two major parties don't agree with, so to speak. If you have good evidence and intuitively rationale, then it's supposed to reappears.
It'd be nice if we could get the word humane into the bill.
We'll talk about it. Claire Smith from a retired GP. I'm quite interested in what you're saying about inquiries, because we've just had this question of inquiry into child sexual abuse, and it's uncovered some truly horrendous and continuing finding stores in child sexual abuse in Tasmania. But because they operated under that protection issue, that absolutely no consequence appear to them accrued from lack of awareness in the public, because people didn't
had some kind of detections might withstand it. So how does the inquiry uncover these kinds of things within that, able to get to the bottom of it issue so that people are not allowed to not get incriminated and then still get some kind of justice or some kind of, repercussions after people have made their findings?
Well, that's always been a legacy of royal commissions that it concludes its investigation done in public, where everybody that is called before the commission has no choice but to answer questions. The privilege against self-incrimination doesn't apply. And if they decide to lie, they, of course, leave themselves exposed to being prosecuted for perjury. So it's for centuries, royal commissions have proved a very effective means of getting to the bottom of serious misconduct. The consequence, however, of their evidence not being admissible against them in a court of law is that it doesn't make it any easier to prosecute them if a decision was made thereafter to charge people. So, glaring example of that in Victoria, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Lawyer X saga, the solicitor who became a prime conveyor of confidential information to police in breach of her responsibility as a legal officer. Huge Royal Commission exposed enormous misconduct by her and senior officers in relation to the way in which they extracted information from her. The Royal Commission made recommendations about investigation and prosecution, concluded its findings. The government created a Special Investigators Office to then look at whether or not there was evidence that would be sufficient to support a prosecution, and notwithstanding that Justice or former Justice Neville from the High Court, who was appointed as Special Investigator, concluded that there were charges that could be laid, the DPP decided not to prosecute. That's invariably a problem that follows, and the same would apply to an Integrity Commission. If it has that privilege, it can get to the bottom of the misconduct, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will advance the question of a successful prosecution, because somehow all the evidence that's been given before the Commission would then have to be converted into an admissible form by investigators, again interviewing those people and hoping that they would give the same account in a form that is admissible in the court of law. That's an ongoing problem, always has been.
And also, of course, in relation to our recent publishing of the inquiry, the particularly painful part about us really struggling with this and continue to work in this space quite actively. A difficulty is that we didn't even have the satisfaction of misconduct findings being made because the commissioners overtly brought the process to an end before they finalised misconduct findings because of the resistance and the obstruction that they were experiencing from the state's lawyers. They said this in the report from the state's lawyers, and because of the fact that because of the nature of the procedural fairness requirements in our Act, it would have been really traumatising to keep going in that process for certain witnesses who would have been dragged back to being cross-examined and things like that around the misconduct findings. So while they indicated that they both have made misconduct findings about individuals, and at least that would have been something of a public recognition and public sense of justice for those who put their heart and soul into trying to make that a meaningful process. We didn't have that. So we were deprived of that. We're now going through a series of entirely irrelevant bar processes, theoretically to deliver some sense of justice, but they are, in my view, continuing to utterly fail us in terms of delivering justice. And it's a shame the Commonwealth difficulty that we have to grapple with here. And I'm terribly sorry for any of the victim survivors or the whistleblowers who were participants in a question of inquiry, and anyone here is in that boat. I'm terribly sorry for the fact that we really failed, actually, and we have existed it.
Megan, could I just add to that? We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in order of importance, the most important thing is that misconduct's exposed. If it's exposed, it means that the institutions where it's occurred can address the problem, the public can be aware of it, there can be an appropriate education and prevention response. Less important, but still significant, is prosecuting the individuals if possible. But we shouldn't confuse the importance of that with the importance of exposing misconduct.
That's very true. We do have 3,000 page report articles, and it is extensive in the degree which it exposes absolute misconduct across the range of institutions and government agencies in the state. So we do have that, and then we'll always have that to keep working on. One more question? Tom?
So, lovely forum, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it the next day. Is it a fair parallel to suggest that Tasmania's rail loop is called a football stadium? Don't look at that.
I'm not sure that's a fair question. I guess comment.
I'm not in a position to comment on that.
You might very well say that. We couldn't possibly comment.
But just occurred to me, Eloise, that one matter we have overlooked, I'll just mention it very briefly, is the significant factor that's identified in the Australia Institute report by 2024. What's missing from the Tasmanian Integrity Commission Act is misconduct by citizens whose objective it is to get public officers to misconduct themselves. So almost all misconduct for public officers involves people who are not part of the executive government. They have an interest in seeing an outcome that serves their interests, which is not in the public interest. I don't know of any other integrity agency in Australia that doesn't provide, that's not just the public officer who's exposed for misconduct, but also the citizen who is influencing the public officer to misconduct themselves. That's a glaring omission from the Act. It needs to be remedied as soon as possible.
Kate was mentioning that, can I just, while I'm looking at the time and having minutes to go over, I'm going to buy from that one actually about stadium. Because I want to bring it back to where Robert started us, which was around the code of conduct and the values and the things that members of Parliament representing their community are meant to uphold. And when decision-making processes about significant public policy matters or significant public expenditure matters, and decision-making processes overtly don't follow good process, that don't take into account appropriate community consultation, that don't respectfully present business cases that are credible and valid and evidence-based considerations for the public to engage with and comment on and assist in that decision-making process. When that doesn't happen, I don't believe then that the executive government is meeting those values against that code of conduct. And that just has been a nice.
Any other thoughts that you'd like to share on the hospital? No?
This was an excellent.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay.
Well, I'd just like to thank our speakers for being here tonight. I hope we've given you some solutions-focused ideas, some of the integrity issues in Tassie. Thank you all for being here tonight. I do need to remind you that the Australian Institute's a charity. We rely on donations to exist, and we couldn't do what we do without all of your support. It is approaching the end of the financial year, so when you're thinking about your end of financial year donations, perhaps you could keep this in mind this time around. I would also like to belatedly acknowledge our elected representatives in the room, our newly elected Mayor of Glenorchy, Sue Hickey, and Helen Burnett, members of Clark, and Forum met our representative for Hobart, Rob Valentine's here. I just also need to let you know, we got this room for free tonight, so thanks to the university for letting us have it. They are having a Democracy Done Differently event next Tuesday night. It's an Island of Ideas event, which I don't know if any of you have been to those, but they're fantastic events. I've been to a few, highly recommend them. Next Tuesday, 6 p.m. at the Sandy Bay campus, so not in the space, and there'll be a range of speakers speaking there, including Lara Gibbs, Phil Esthwaite, Dr. Charlie Burton, Dr. Ron Hortle, and Erin Clifford Douglas from The Conversation. Ooh, and just to continue on with the discussion about integrity in politics, the Human Rights Law Centre are coming to town in a couple of weeks, and they'll be speaking at a town hall meeting about whistleblowing and the ecosystem of accountability, and the event's called Transparency for the Planet. That's on Friday the 12th of July at 6 p.m, so pop that in your diaries too. Thanks everyone. Not soon.
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.